Uh, I want to welcome Steve Rennie tonight. Uh, and I met Steve just a couple of years ago at the Fred conference when he was one of the presenters there. And I was immediately like blown away by his presentation. And I, this guy was really kind of special in a way. He's very unassuming. But if you have a chance, those many reminders that I send out, 2 week, 1 week, final reminder about the presentation for 19th century speaker series and also the book clubs. But um, read Steve's biography. And I didn't realize how deep of a journalistic history he has. So it's just very interesting. And it kind of says something about like, coming from this profession and then applying it to, in a sense, his hobby, 19th century baseball. And it's very, very insightful, very interesting, and very impressive. uh, so I want to introduce Steve Rennie. He's going to be talking about, I want to get the title right again, Whaling at Bat, Baseball on Ice in the 19th century Canadian Arctic. Think about that for a moment. And you can imagine them trying to play baseball up there and doing it, I guess, making it happen. And Bob, I know you have a few ground rules you want to go over, and we'll
Let me
turn it up
just ask everybody to other than the speaker, please mute yourself in case there's any ambient or background noise that pops up. And if you have a question, please just run your cursor down to the bottom of the black screen, hit chat, and a box will show in the bottom right-hand corner where you can type any comments or questions, and we will address all of those at the close of Steve's presentation. We've got our 28th coming in. It's a nice crowd tonight. Again, Steve, we're looking forward to this. The time, what is it? Whalers at Bat, Baseball on Ice in the 19th century Canadian Arctic. I agree with Peter. Yeah. Arctic and baseball are not two words that you see in many sentences. So, Steve, if you'd like to bring up your slides.
Yeah, let me know when you can see that.
I
I'll switch
just
to
got there.
presentation mode.
There's a, now you can go to full screen.
Yeah. So, oops. Okay.
There we go. All right, Steve, it's all yours. Take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really, really flattered that you were interested in hearing about this presentation and what I'm going to be talking about today. Happy Veterans Day and Remembrance Day here in Canada too. Remiss if I didn't mention that. And I think the timing of this presentation is, well, for some of us, I think is very timely. I'm in Ottawa, Canada, and we just got a ton of snow dumped on us. So it feels very atmospheric right now to be presenting about whalers up in the north. I've slightly tweaked the title to just the 19th century Arctic because there is a little bit that I'll be talking about in Alaska later in the presentation. So I just wanted to make sure I cover the full range of the Arctic. So I will move ahead with the presentation here. Oopsie. Hang on. Okay. So I'm going to be breaking this presentation into three broad sections. So pre-1860s, I'll be talking about some Indigenous bat and ball games that would have happened in the North, at that period. And then there'll be a period in the 1860s to roughly the 1880s where I'll be talking about ball playing in the Eastern Arctic, so up in Cumberland Sound and Hudson Bay and those areas. And then I'll be finishing off by talking about baseball in the Western Arctic at Herschel Island and Point Barrow, and some just amazing stories there. This is all coming from some research I've done for a book that I'm working on right now that should be out in early 2027 on baseball during the Klondike Gold Rush and the North during the 19th century. So I hope you find it interesting. So we'll start with some of the Indigenous bat and ball games prior to the 1860s. One of the first documents I was able to find that referenced a bat and ball game came from Elisha Kent Kane. He was a explorer who had been leading the second Grinnell expedition, searching for the lost ships of Sir John Franklin. Sir John Franklin had been searching for the Northwest Passage, and his ships, the Erebus and the Terror, disappeared in 1846. When after a number of years, no trace had turned up of them, and Franklin's wife had begun trying to encourage searches for her husband's ships. In addition to sort of the British Navy had gone searching for them as well, but some private searches were subsequently launched, and Elisha Kent Kane led the second Grinnell expedition, which was a gentleman named Henry Grinnell, who was a American merchant and philanthropist who sponsored the expedition. So Elisha Kent Kane went up to Edda it's the northernmost community in Greenland. You can see it there on the map. And he writes in his book about children playing ball up there. So it's not baseball, but it's a bat and ball game that they're playing. So you can see here the excerpt that I've underlined with the children playing with a curved rib of some big amphibian, but probably a walrus or something unlikely to be an amphibian, playing bat and ball amongst the drifts. And there's other references in his writings as well. So when he's leaving Edda, he meets up with a local guide who takes him to a playground. And at the playground, he can see these children with a walrus rib and using it as a bit of a bat or a golf or a shinny stick. And they're using it to drive the ball up a frozen snowbank. And they're playing and they're laughing. And so it's not baseball, but it is a bat and ball game that's being played by these indigenous children as far north as you can go, essentially in Greenland in 1855. So that's a very early reference to a bat and ball game. And then you can see a photo from, or an illustration from Kane's work there on the right-hand side. There's also other indigenous games. So there's Analiagatuk, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, and Mukpon, which are two different indigenous bat and ball games that are played up in the Arctic. Mukpon is essentially, it's played with two bases spaced about 70 to 100 feet apart. And after the batter hits the ball, they have to run to the far base and back before they are hit with the ball to get out. So you're essentially trying to soak the batter. And they play all ages and all genders, so boys, girls are playing, so that's Mukpon. There's a work that I found that was very helpful in my research, the application of a theory of games to transitional Eskimo culture. So they kind of break down Mukpon and Analiagatuk. So in this, they have Mukpon as the two-base game that I just described. Analiagatuk is a four-base game, which is more closely resembling rounders or baseball. And in that work, he also describes another game. So you can see he's sort of drawn here how it would be, how the field would look. So you'd have the batter and the pitcher, so very similar to baseball, but you have four bases here, and then they have to run home instead of three. And so the idea would be, you'd hit the ball and you'd run to the first stone without being hit, and then the next person would come up and you'd advance the batter, or you'd advance the players around the bases till you scored a run. So very, very similar to baseball. There's also in Alaska, in the Kenai Peninsula, there's a game called Aleut baseball, or Aleut baseball, which is very similar to the centuries-old Russian game of Lapta. And that makes sense. The Russians likely would have introduced it during their colonization period when they in the early 1800s. Although the game now is very much the Sukpiat people consider it their own distinct game. So they've adapted the game from Lapta, and it's still played there. You can see the field or on the bottom left-hand corner, and that's I won't even begin to try to explain how Lapta is played because it's beyond my realm of comprehension, but you can see there's the diagram there. And then on the right-hand side, there's an illustration of Lapta. But now we can talk about baseball. So we've talked about some of the early bat and ball games. So baseball in the Eastern Arctic first shows up in 1860. Before I talk about that though, I'll talk a little bit about why whalers were spending their winters up in the Arctic in the first place. So prior to the 1850s, the whalers would go looking for right whales around Greenland and in the North Atlantic. And eventually the supply of whales started to dwindle, and they needed to go further and further north to look for whales. And before they were overwintering in the Arctic, these were very lengthy expeditions. So they would leave from ports in England, or they would leave from ports in the United States, and they would have to go up to look for these whales in the Arctic, and then turn around and come back. It's a very short season up there. The ice forms quickly, and so you don't have, you're wasting a lot of time essentially traveling to and from the Arctic when you could be going at it a lot more quickly. And so in the 1850s, with the advent of steam powering some of these ships, they were able to go further, and they realized that they could essentially find a safe harbor, a sheltered harbor in the Arctic, and they could essentially park themselves there for the winter. And so what they would do was they would find the harbor, they would push up a bunch of snow against the ship to block it from being crushed from the ice. Still incredibly dangerous to do this. And they would basically spend the whole winter there. And as soon as the ice melted, or they would break it up as it started to thaw, they would be able to escape the harbor, and then they could go and start their whaling season a lot earlier than if they had to come from another port in the south. And they would often trade with local Inuit populations as well. So that was a big part of their survival up there. They would bring supplies for sometimes several winters, but having fresh meat and things like that were very beneficial to them, and so that was a big part of the trade. And there's a lot that goes along with that. But so that was interesting in itself. But then when I started going through the ship's logbooks, I started seeing all these references to baseball as a way that they kind of coped with the isolation and the harsh conditions. And so I'll just show you some of the examples of baseball that I found in these logs. Actually, before I do that, though, I'll just quickly talk about where the Yankee whalers came from. So they would have been sailing out of ports in New Bedford, Nantucket, New London, Sag Harbor in New York, and many, many others. But those were some of the big ones that they would have left from. So here you can see a logbook entry from December 25th, Christmas Day of 1860, of the ship, the Daniel Webster, which was in the Cumberland Sound. And they talk about playing ball. You can see I've underlined it there. So they don't explicitly say baseball, but it's very likely that was the game being played, that it wasn't soccer or some other ball game. And you can see later logbooks that we'll go through where they explicitly mention baseball, but the earliest one I could find of reference to any kind of ball playing was from this entry in 1860 in Cumberland Sound. 2 years later, the Black Eagle in Hudson Bay, Depot Island, says the men were employed in playing ball, all well on board. Next day, same ship, same place. Again, a reference to playing ball, and there's some hunting going on as well. So these are the different activities that the whalers would have been up to. So, baseball was one way that they could deal with. It would give the crew some exercise, it would boost morale. It would be a good way for them to spend some of their free time. 1864 on the Concordia, again in Hudson Bay. This is all hands playing ball, and they talk about the temperature and things like that. One of the things I noticed about these logbooks as I was going through them is, depending on who was writing them, they could be either very expressive or they could be very spare. And so you can see some of these ones are very spare. There's other ones later on where they start talking a bit about the games themselves. So you can, and you'll see when I get to Herschel Island, there were extremely detailed record keeping that went into some of these ball games. In 1881, on the ship the George and Mary, which was in Hudson Bay, so November and December. So we see November 30th, sealing in baseball, December 1st, baseball, and then a fancy dress, a ball, like a party. And on December 29th, playing baseball, and then football, and some other sliding down the hill, dancing in the evening. So again, baseball being a big part of the social scene. 1887 on the Alexander, again in Hudson Bay, Says the boys have been playing baseball this afternoon. It talks about some of the other things that they've seen, and some of the people that came on board the ship. So you can see lots of these early references to baseball. These are just a few of the examples of the logbooks that reference it, but there's many, many others. So that fairly well covers the Eastern Arctic. It's the Western Arctic that starts to get really, really interesting about baseball really taking off. So we go to Alaska in the summer of 1868. I'm sure many of you have seen this particular article from the Columbian Weekly Register from New Haven, Connecticut. And it talks about these commercial agents from New London, Connecticut, who had gone to St. Paul Island to work in the sealing trade, and talks about the ball club that they started, the Knock 'em Down and Skin 'em Club. And it lists all the players from the team. So Daniel Webster, not the ship Daniel Webster that we just saw a second ago, but actually a person named Daniel Webster is here. And then we have a few folks from Connecticut as well. These people all really did exist. Like, I was able to look into their backgrounds, and they were there at the time. They're sorry, I can speak to the Americans that were there. I can't speak to the Islanders that were there, but like Jeremiah Potts and Frank Morgan and Daniel Webster were all records show that they were there at the time. So then there's a challenge essentially that anybody from the mainland United States is invited to come to St. Paul Island to play against this team. This is an interesting and completely fabricated article from 1889. So I'll just read it to you because it's completely ridiculous. So it's baseball played on ice in the land of the midnight sun. It's a short article and it's kind of small, so maybe I'll just read it out. So it says, perhaps no stranger game of baseball was ever played than that between the nines from the icebound whalers and the revenue cutter Thetis during the time of the pinch on the last trip. Tobacco was rather short, so a store of the weed was put up as a stake, and a challenge sent and accepted. A ball was carefully constructed with a cork core, successive wrappings of yarn, and a piece of rubber pemmican bag covered with walrus hide. Could hardly be distinguished from a league ball when completed. Bats were hewed out of pieces of drift and gloves made of sealskin. A diamond was marked out on the great stretch of smooth ice, and the game began with the Arctics, as the whalers called themselves, at bat. Jim Dugan, mate of the Orca, managed the Arctics, and Jack Gallagher of the Balena did the twirling. A lieutenant and cook constituted the battery for the Thetis nine, all distinctions of rank being lost sight of in the enthusiasm of the moment. An irritating delay was caused in the middle of the third inning. The harpooner of the Orca came to bat with a walrus tusk and swatted the ball so hard it bounded over a lead of open water, while a heavy hitter slid around all the bases for a home run. But the ball was lost, and the game had to be postponed for a day while another ball was being made. A foul strike was claimed on account of the walrus tusk, but disallowed, the umpire being a whaler himself. At the end of the seventh inning, the score stood 43-43, and the excitement was intense. Suddenly, the umpire fell through a blowhole and called the game until he could be rescued and dried out. Before he was thoroughly dried, the ice parted, the vessel sailed away, and the game was never concluded. I'm going to tell you why this is completely made up. These ships did exist. They just never were in the same place at the same time. So from August 10th to 11th in 1889, the Thetis, which is the revenue cutter that's mentioned, did meet the Balena after leaving Cape Smith, heading east. So those ships were there. August 15th to 16th of 1889, the Thetis met the Orca and the Thrasher, Herschel Island, but the Balena was not there. So one of the ships that we just talked about was not there. So logs show that the Balena, the Thetis, and the Orca were never together at the same place at the same time during that 1889 voyage. The Thetis log also makes zero mention of baseball. It doesn't record the ship as being trapped in ice during any of these encounters. The Thetis did get stuck in the ice later, but baseball is not mentioned at all during that period. But there's more. So when writing about the voyage of the Thetis in National Geographic in 1890, the captain of the ship described the recreational activities that took place on August 11th, and baseball is not one of them. He does talk about them playing football and snowballing, but like that's actually throwing snowballs at each other, not some kind of reference to baseball. The other reference is there's a captain of one of the ships of the Grampus, Hearts and Bodfish, who we'll see later when we talk about Herschel Island, mentions these ships that came to Herschel Island on the 11th, but there's no mention of the Balena there either. So I believe that this article was it was a colorful account, but I think completely fabricated. But it wouldn't take long before baseball did come to the north, Herschel Island and Point Barrow in the 1890s. So Herschel Island became the main base for American whaling operations in the Arctic during the 1890s. It's a small island just off the Yukon coast in the Beaufort Sea. And Pauline Cove was the place where the whalers spent their winters. So as many as 500 to 600 people lived there during the winter. So this is women, children, the whalers themselves. They built communities, they built structures. And you'll see us in a minute. I have some illustrations of what it looked like at Pauline Cove. It was sort of the perfect place in the Beaufort Sea because it was a sheltered harbor, and it let them essentially freeze up for the winter, stay there for the winter. And baseball was extremely important to their social life while they were up in the north. One of the ways we know so much about Herschel Island is Hearts and Bodfish. So I mentioned him a second ago. He was the captain of the Newport at the time, and he kept really detailed logs that listed dozens and dozens of baseball games between 1894 and 1896, and I'll show them to you in a minute. The first one that he documents was played on February the 19th of 1894 between officers and boat steerers of the Newport. And then a short time later, just a few weeks later, they formed a league made up of 4 teams. So they had the Herschels, the Northern Lights, the Arctics, and the Pickups. The following season, it became a little more, the league became more formalized. So we had new or newly named teams joining. So the Dewdrops and the Non-Praries replaced the Pickups and the Northern Lights. And all of this is documented in Hearts and Bodfish's log, as well as some other whaling logs that I was able to find. So here you can see 2 pages of his log. It's kind of hard to see, but he has the date on the far left-hand side. So it's February 21st, 22nd, it gets to March, April. And then you can see the teams. So the Arctics and the Dewdrops, the score, really, really hard to read those, but he's documented every game that was played during that 1895 season. And so you can see that there. And I'll show you a couple other pages as well. This was these are some tournaments that were held later in June that I'll talk about in a sec. And then on the right-hand side, he's got his own stats. So balls caught by myself in left field, and he's listed all his own statistics on that side too. So they took a lot of great care to make sure that they were documenting all the results of the baseball games. This is a painting by one of the whalers, Captain John Bertuccini, who's known as Johnny the Painter. And he commanded the whaling ship Jeanette. And Bertuccini Island in the Beaufort Sea is actually named after him. So you can see this is sort of what it would look like. You have these ships that are frozen into the ice here. They've got the mountains in the background. There are some buildings that they were able to build. And then in the bottom, you can see a baseball diamond. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you see some spectators around the edge. And then you've got the diamond marked out in, those were ashes from the ship's stoves that they used to mark out the lines of the diamond. You can see them playing, and it looks like a skating rink or maybe a soccer game or something on the next to the baseball diamond. Some other sporting activity happening there. Here's another picture that he painted. So you can see the same thing. The ships are all frozen in. You've got some buildings there. You've got the mountains in the background, and on the bottom right-hand side this time you can see the baseball diamond. The spectators up in the top corner, and then you can see some of the people on the field there. Sophie Porter was the captain of, or was the wife of one of the captains of one of the ships that was frozen in there. And I love this entry because it really captures the adaptation really nicely of the game up there. So she says, there's a game of baseball played every day on she originally wrote ground and then scratched it out and wrote ice on top, which is just, I think that's, like, if that doesn't capture exactly how the game adapted in the North, I don't know what else did. So really nice entry in her logbook. And she also writes about other games that were played, as did other captains and log keepers who were in the north at the time. I'll talk about a couple of notable games from Herschel Island. So this comes from one of the pages I showed you a minute ago. So in June of 1895, there was a championship series between the crews, steamers of a sailing vessel and the steamer crews. And so the sailing team won all 7 games. They won the opener 26-10, and then they won all the rest of the games in the series. And then 2 of the captains, so James Tilton from the Thrasher and Edward Coffin from the Rosario, formed new teams that had another 5-game series with 40 pounds of tobacco on the line. And so Tilton's side won 3-2 in that series on June 29th. So typically the baseball season would have run from February till about sort of May, June. At that point, the ice is broken up and the whaling season starts, and they're not spending a lot of time playing baseball. There are references to games on July the 4th where they would stop and they would have celebrations, and baseball would be part of that. But most of the games, or I should say rather, all the games in their season were typically held between February and June. And the reason for that was the ice was solid at that point. There was not really a whole lot to do. They were waiting for the ice to break up. And so it was just one of the rules they had in the Herschel Island Baseball League was essentially you had to play a game every day, regardless of the conditions. So it could be really treacherous weather outside, and you were still expected to play. And what they would do is they would, if they wanted to get a game going, they would raise a white flag up, and work would stop, and the men would gather, and they would have a baseball game, and there was lots of betting. That was a big part of it as well too. The spectators would place lots of bets on these games, and so if you weren't playing, you were still getting a way to enjoy it that way. There was a game on July the 4th. So I mentioned 4th of July games. This one was a really interesting one because it was a bit controversial. So on July the 4th, Hearts and Bodfish, the captain I talked about a minute ago, and George Leavitt, they had organized a game between their crews. And so there's all kinds of betting going on. There's noisy celebrations. People are really excited to see the game. Leavitt's team was not expected to win. They were widely seen as the much poorer team of the two. Hearts and Bodfish's team was seen as a much stronger side. But Bodfish's team lost, surprisingly, 9-4. And so people were really surprised by this. But then it came out that 2 of Bodfish's players had been caught taking bribes to throw the game. And so Bodfish was furious about this and demanded a rematch that went 13 innings. And his team won 1-0. And it was praised by another whaler named Jim Allen as one of the finest games he's ever seen. So you can see some of the writings about that here. So on the top hand, this is from Bodfish's log, where he says, played a game of ball, score 9-4. Captain Leavitt's team won. So he's very direct and succinct to the point. I doesn't want to elaborate. This is before he knows that the players have been taking bribes. On the part on the bottom is from a whaler named Jim Allen, who wrote a book many years later and writes about this game, and he talks about the bribing scandal. And goes into why. I guess it had been a joke, or they claimed it was a joke played on Bodfish's team. So he talks about that. There was these games are not without tragedy. So in March of 1897, there was a game taking place on the ice, and the players didn't really see it till it was too late. But a massive blizzard came upon them. And very, very quickly. So the players all ran as fast as they could to try to get back to their ships for safety. Not everybody made it back. The blizzard lasted for 18 hours. There's writings in all the logbooks and subsequent books that the whalers wrote about this, that the ships are creaking and they weren't sure if they were going to make it through the night. Really, really terrible blizzard. When the storm did pass, they went to look for some of the missing people, and they found that a couple of the sailors had died. Several of the Inuit people there as well. One Norwegian sailor survived, but had to have some amputations because he had some really bad frostbite. So just a really, really treacherous situation in that spring of 1897. Now we go to Point Barrow in 1898. Point Barrow, Alaska, not too, if you trace a line going westward from Herschel Island, you get to Barrow. And that is where 8 American whaling ships became trapped in the ice in September of 1897. So nearly 300 men were stranded on these ships. The ice was crushing the ships, and they had to actually evacuate a few of them. And so what happened was they got out of some of the ships, and they all scrambled onto the Belvedere and other ships. But there was too many of them. They couldn't just all climb onto the ship like that. They needed to get to safety. They needed to get somewhere. The closest whaling station was Point Barrow, which was 65 miles away across the ice. So the men abandoned the Belvedere and they trekked across the ice to Point Barrow in really awful conditions. So they tried to grab as much as they could. They grabbed their parkas, they grabbed bedding that they could carry with them, any supplies they could bring with them, as much as they could, and they made it to Barrow. Meanwhile, the ship owners had learned of this, and they appealed to President McKinley, who ordered a massive rescue operation to get the sailors back and rescue them. There was only one ship that was capable of reaching the Arctic, which was the Bear, but at that point the ice was too thick. It was not able to break through the ice to get to the sailors. And so they needed to launch a very audacious overland rescue expedition to try to reach the sailors. And so the expedition was led by Lieutenant David Jarvis, and he was joined by Ellsworth Berthoff and Samuel Call, who I'll just mention in a second as an interesting footnote for Northern baseball. They drove a herd of reindeer and dog sled about 1,500 miles through the Arctic winter. So from the fall of 1897 into 1898 to reach Point Barrow. And when they got there, they were able to supply the stranded whalers with food, and they found them in a really, really rough shape. The sanitation was really bad. Morale was terrible. The men were physically not doing very well. And so one of the things they did to restore the health of the whalers was baseball. So they instituted daily baseball games. And that was essentially to get the men having some structure in their day, having some physical exercise. If you weren't playing, you were expected to go watch. And so that was a huge part of the recovery. So Jim Allen is one of those stranded whalers, and he writes about the baseball game. So he talks about Jarvis giving orders not to play baseball or take walks. You didn't want to go too far because you could get lost and stranded on the ice. And he talks about the chief engineer of one of the ships, James Denny. He said he calls him a former professional baseball player who really knew the game. And he was asked to umpire the games. He's likely confusing James Denny with his brother Jerry, who was playing in the Connecticut State League at the time in 1897 and 1898, and he also was working in the hotel business at that point. But he had played for the 1884 Providence Grays in their pennant-winning season. So it's very likely that he was confusing the Denny brothers. I'm sure that James Denny played ball, but not at the level of his brother. And eventually, rescue ships were able to reach Point Barrow in the summer of 1898, and it was praised as a heroic success, and the whalers were all brought back to their homes. And that sort of marked the end of sort of Northern whalers baseball at the time. So it's kind of an interesting. I think that brings me close to the end of the presentation too. So I know I'm a little bit early, but yeah. So we'll stop it maybe there. It's an interesting history that's not, I would say, terribly well known. I think that Arctic baseball, in some cases, some of those 1860 games would have taken place before you see documented games in places like Indianapolis and Charlotte and even Atlanta. so it's interesting to just see that the North has this very long history with the game that's just not terribly well known. So I know I'm a bit ahead of schedule here, but happy to take any questions you might have.
Steve, thank you very much. It's kind of fascinating just to look at. You don't think in that kind of environment. It's one thing to play a game because you just got to do something, but there was a lot of games being played up there. Baseball was popular certainly in Canada and United States, but they just bring equipment with them, and what do they do? Shovel the snow off the ice to play?
Yeah, so that was the equipment was one of the challenges because they had to sort of make do with what they had. So in places like Herschel Island, they would have had to hew bats. So Bodfish, the captain that I mentioned, actually was spent a big part of the month of January before the season started just making bats out of like old masts and other wood that he was able to come by. So they had to get really inventive and creative in terms of the equipment. In terms of like gloves, they were likely wearing big thick mitts with their parkas, so you wouldn't necessarily need a glove itself, and it wouldn't have fit over the mitt over the parka mitt anyway. So you could use those. And then what they would do is they would use ashes from the ship's stove to trace out the outlines of the bases. And they had to kind of just adapt the game. And I think that's sort of this real story of this. It's the adaptation of baseball to the northern environment is really amazing. And you see that in other examples that I came across when I was doing my research on the Klondike during the gold rush there. In some of the places where they played, they're playing on sandbars and they're playing in other areas, and they really have to get creative because they don't have a lot of flat surface, or they don't have, in a lot of cases, the permafrost prevents proper drainage. So you get these kind of wet conditions, and they have to play through them. And it just shows that they love the game and they want to find as many ways as they can to play it, and they'll adapt the game to their circumstances.
Woody Eckert asked a question. Is there any information on rule adjustments or overrunning or sliding into bases?
I imagine there's probably a lot of sliding into bases on some of the guys, whether intentional or not. They tried to play by typical rules. So, 3 outs, and they played with innings and as much as they could. Now, the challenge would be daylight was in short supply in some of these places so especially in the Herschel Island games. So when you're playing from February to May or June, it's pretty dark up there at that point. You're only getting a few hours of daylight. And so, that would be a challenge, I imagine, seeing the ball in some of these places.
What were their activities in their daily life was mostly ship maintenance?
Yeah, it's primarily when they were at in the harbors frozen, it was a lot of just working on the ship. So like making sure that everything was running well, getting ready for the coming whaling season. So if there were any repairs that needed to be done, they were doing repairs. They were fixing up the sails if the sails needed fixing. Primarily ship maintenance. Hunting was also a big part of it too. So they would, they had supplies that they had brought with them, but fresh meat to prevent scurvy was really important. So they would either trade with local Inuit population up there, or they would try to hunt seal or other animals that they could find. So that would pretty much consume their days. And then if they had some free time, they would do things like play baseball, or cards was also popular. They played cards with each other, or things like that.
Jacob Coffin posted on the chat line there evidence of walrus ball, where what doesn't look like walrus, looks like whales and baseball players.
I'm just using some Chat GPT AI art. It's my fake evidence here.
Very fascinating. That's the sort of thing you don't see often. Dixie Tronjo has got a question.
I was just wondering if you ran across exactly how 300 people managed to stay alive for a couple of months until they got rescued. How did they do that?
Yeah, so Charles Brower was the guy who ran the station up in Point Barrow, and he ran a tight ship. So I mean, the conditions were pretty bad up there. Like they were
Automatically.
yeah, they're overcrowded. Hygiene is, forget it. Like that's not even a consideration at that point. Um, but he did have supplies of food that were rationed out up there, not for 300 people, so they had to make do. So there was hunting. So there was ducks not too far away that they could hunt if they needed to. There was other animals they could hunt. Um, so that was, but they were not in great shape. Like when the Jarvis rescue team reached them, a lot of them were malnourished. Scurvy was starting to become an issue. And so thankfully the Overland Rescue Expedition had brought a lot of supplies that were able to supplement what Brower and had already at the station at Point Barrow. But yeah, that not a good scene.
All right. If there's, I'm trying to think. They're going there, so the people on the ship just say, "Well, let's go have a game of baseball."
Well, a lot of
Or
them,
was it a kind of? It seemed like it got to be a regular thing wherever they went. That was one of the things on the list of things you could do.
yeah, it was by far the most popular sport. I mean, they did other things too. They would go sledding actually through. So some of the harbors that they would stay at in places like the Eastern Arctic, they had mountains or hills around them, and so the men would go tobogganing and sledding on those, and they would, it was kind of like kids playing, and when you think about it, typical things you do outside in the wintertime. These are sailors that are whalers that are doing these things. But baseball was the most popular sport. There's not as many references to things like them playing soccer or other sports up there. More because I think that the surface would be hard for a soccer ball to roll around. Like it's not a flat ice surface. It's very bumpy. So you can run on it or slide it, as it were, for baseball, but it makes it a little bit easier. The thing too is like the harbor lends itself well to a game like baseball. Like you are able to play it there because you don't need a ton of equipment, right? Like they would. It's unlikely they brought bats or things like that with them. They usually fashioned it out of whatever materials they had up there, but you didn't need a ton of equipment to play. Really, just the bat and the ball at that point. So, yeah, no, it was that was by far, and it was the most popular sport in the States at that time too. So it was natural that these whalers would have taken the game they would have played at home anyway and brought it up there. It's what they knew. That was one of the things I think that came out to me in all my research, not just for this, but for the Klondike too. It's that people are always looking for, when they're in these strange and unusual places, you're looking for a piece of home. And for a lot of these guys, a piece of home was baseball. It's a way to be connected with a place that you're hundreds or thousands of miles away from. And you're in these really bizarre, unforgiving, harsh conditions. And so you look for like kind of the equivalent of comfort food. And for a lot of these guys, it's baseball.
Hey, Steve, this is Craig. Great presentation. Two things. I noticed in that one illustration or both illustrations, the of the ball field, they had actually fashioned a backstop. It looked like there was a wall of ice that was made to be a backstop. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then a question on that fabricated story. Why was that, do you think, created? Was that just a piece of narrative that someone needed to write, or what was the purpose of that fabricated story?
It's a good question. I suspect there was probably a kernel of truth, right? Like they probably got a report of a baseball game, and the journalist writing it took heavy creative license and created this game, which was probably more interesting than the actual game that would have taken place. And it kind of falls back on these stereotypes, right? Like you're using walrus tusks and people are falling through the ice, and who's going to fact check it back then too? So it's not like there's an easy way to disprove it until 100 years later start going through whaling logs and kind of triangulating where all the ships were at that time and figuring out where they were.
Stu, you got a question?
Yeah, it's a follow-up on what Craig asked, and I'm glad he did because I was many things from this presentation. Steve will stick with me, but that one jumped out at me, the fabricated story in San Francisco. Did you find this in any other newspapers? And the reason I ask is 20 years later, I've been trying to track down another myth, which maybe there's a kernel of truth to, with Andy Euler and his 2-foot home run. And it goes back to obviously fabricated story that may have a kernel of truth. I've never found the kernel, but that one was in many newspapers across the country, like a syndicated story that was in many papers, but they were papers like Hutchinson, Kansas, San Francisco, not the San Francisco newspapers, things like that. So that's why that one jumped out at me. Were there any other places that you saw that story, or was it kind of a one-off for the San Francisco paper, or does anybody have any kind of idea of these kinds of things happening back then, with fabricated stories maybe being spread out throughout the country?
I don't think that the one I found was a syndicated article. I wasn't able to find it in other papers, although it's possible that it did appear. I haven't seen it. I suspect that the earlier one from 1868, the Knockin' Down and Skinnin' Club, is somewhat fabricated. Like I do believe that these commercial agents were probably playing baseball there. They came from New England. Baseball was certainly around at that point. So, it's entirely plausible that these men in their early 20s would have, again, trying to find that connection from home, would have started playing baseball there. To the extent that the people named, like, they named some of the Hawaii, the Islanders that are on the team, like maybe they were real people. Maybe it was the journalists sort of having a bit of fun. So those, again, it's really hard because nobody's there to sort of fact check these things, so you don't know if it actually it happened or not. But those were, I would say, the two.
Good. Well, good job on triangulating it a century later, and good job for the pursuit of that. I've found that people didn't like the Andy Euler myth being destroyed, and I thought of that yesterday, or whatever, the 50th anniversary of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and that the songwriter took some liberties. Well, big deal. That's a song, but that was controversial. I'm all for digging up what really happened. So good job on that.
Well, I just thought, because you do one of these presentations, and I'm sure anybody could just dig up that article and say, well, how come you didn't mention this one? And I just wanted to say that I have seen it. I looked into it because it seemed a little too far-fetched for me. And then, thankfully I was able to have access to the logbooks of the ships that were up there at that time. And, because initially I didn't, I just wanted to see what happened, because it seemed interesting to me. But then you start seeing, well, here's the window of time where they could have been there, or that we know where they were there. And you start going through and realizing, well, there's zero mention to baseball here. This is, it seems like if an umpire fell through the ice, that would be noteworthy to put in the log. But it doesn't make an appearance anywhere. And then, I started looking at the other ships' logs and realizing, oh, wait, none of these ships were actually in the places that they said they were. So again, maybe a kernel of truth from a game involving different ships, but certainly not the circumstances they describe.
Dixie, you got something?
I got another question. Is obviously the logbooks are key here. For the rest of us on the screen tonight who will never ever do anything like this, where do you go to find such logbooks?
So that thankfully the New Bedford Whaling Museum has digitized all of these logbooks, and they're available through the Internet Archive. So they publish them through Internet Archive, or I think it's internet.org. But that's a huge resource, because I mean, otherwise you'd have to go down to New Bedford and go through some of these logbooks. But they've digitized everything. Now the challenge is they're not, you can't search them because it's all handwritten. So you've got to go through the logs sort of page by page and look for references to baseball. The one thing that helps is I know their season essentially doesn't start, like the earliest it could start is sort of November-ish, because the ice is not hard enough usually in September and October. And then, the season would end typically in the spring. So that narrows it. So at least I'm not having to look through the whole year. Like I didn't spend a ton of time looking through sort of July, August, September, even October. I kind of narrowed it to the seasons where I knew they were playing baseball. And then you can see as you go through the whaling logs, like that is typically their season. So, they spend the first part of the winter getting themselves ready and getting the ships winterized. And then they've got some time. And so, come January, February, baseball starts up and that's the season. So it just going through enough of these helps to sort of figure out like what the season would have been. And that helps me from having to go through, possibly months that don't have anything. But it can be tedious. Like anybody who's gone through these handwritten documents, it's, you really appreciate penmanship when you come
And it
across
was
a good
good
one.
penmanship.
Some of them are pretty terrible. So hard to make it out.
Was there an oh wow moment at any point when you were going through all these logbooks?
When I found the first one from 1860, that was it for me, because I had read about the Herschel Island one before, and I thought that was interesting. But I didn't realize the games were being played in the Eastern Arctic. I'd never seen that anywhere. And so I started going through these logbooks, and that when I hit this 1860, I thought, oh my goodness, like this is really early for baseball, especially in the Eastern Arctic, because I hadn't really come across anything there. And then I started really diving into some of those Eastern Arctic ones, and I was able to find more. But yeah, I hadn't read anything about the East. So as soon as I found the first one in the East, it was, oh, okay, I think I've stumbled onto something here.
Martin LaCosta comments that very interesting. Steve, never thought this existed. Well researched, especially digging into the ship's logs. It was a great find for this. It's like when you were talking about the fabricating. Vince wrote that we have Fred Carroll and his dead monkey buried under home plate here in Pittsburgh. I have no idea what that's talking about. I know a lot about baseball. Fred Carroll and his monkey is not part of that.
I was just commenting on the myth of fabrication. There's a local legend. Fred Carroll was a rural catcher, and he had a pet monkey, but the myth was that the pet monkey died and he buried it under home plate so he could always be near his beloved pet. But the monkey died like 2 or 3 weeks prior to the first game, so he'd be carrying a rotten monkey carcass around. It doesn't make much sense, but Andy Tarek actually made it be, if he's still here, he made it become a reality with another marker, but I'll leave Andy to that one.
All right, very, very good. Will we?
One thing I was going to mention too, I completely forgot in the presentation, but I mentioned a guy named Samuel Call, and I said to come back to him, and I never did. So I would just be remiss if I didn't do that, because he's an important part of the story of baseball in the North. So he was the physician that went up with that rescue team to rescue at Point Barrow. He had bounced around the North for many years, including playing in some of those islands off of Alaska, or living in some of those islands of Alaska, working for the Alaska Commercial Company. But he actually was one of the drivers of getting baseball started in Nome, Alaska during the rush there in 1899. So there's reports of games up there, and he's one of the big backers of baseball. He's one of the key drivers of the game. He was the sort of the doctor in town at the time. He'd moved to Nome, and he was really sort of one of the main organizers of baseball. So he's a nice kind of link between some of the whalers that I talked about, and then some of the work that I've also done looking into baseball during the gold rushes. So whether the Klondike Rush, the Nome Rush, or later in Fairbanks too, and other places.
Jacob Goffin also added an interesting observation here. I've always appreciated the irregular playing condition, surfaces, dimensions of 19th century baseball, including its deep ties to the natural world, pastoral imagery. This is a great addition to that concept. Unfortunately, my local high school obviously fits in with ice baseball, is turning to AstroTurf. Too many players these days balk at the idea, even poorly maintained infield dirt. They wouldn't make the all-star team in an ice game. I guess not. How did they pick the players? If you got
Typically,
300 guys on the ship or a couple of ships, how did they pick the team? And is there any notes in the logs that say this guy was really good? If you had him on your team, this was a star baseball player on ice.
Yeah, it's one of the things that the logs fall down on is they don't get into sort of commentary about the level of play. Typically they tend to be the scores of the games. And Bodfish's log is by far the most detailed. The other one sort of mentioned there was a baseball game played today, but they don't really. Sometimes they'll put a score, but not not any kind of commentary in the game. So it's unfortunate we don't get to see. But typically the teams would have been arranged by ship. So a ship would have, their best 9 would have come out and represented that ship, and they would have played other teams. And they took names like the Nonpareils and the Herschels and the Arctics and things like that. But typically they would represent the same ship.
I can just see a tryout on ice where the Orca gonna have a tryout at 3 in the morning when the sun is up.
It's got to be like there's got to be like a special hit that on the ice works better than in real dirt or something, I'd imagine. Anyway.
Well, I can remember playing on skin infield. I can't remember playing on ice. Steve, thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. Very interesting. I've learned a lot about other things going on in baseball in the oddest places, and I thank you for bringing it to our attention. Peter, if you want to close out, we're 1 minute away from 9 o'clock.
Well, I started off by saying, talking a little bit about Steve's journalist background, but I didn't say investigative journalist. And I would have fell right hook, line, and sinker if I was like researching Arctic baseball and came about these 2 ships playing each other. You demonstrated was actually a possibility. So, hats off to you for doing that. And it was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Really breathed some life into Arctic baseball for sure. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I know Steve is going to be talking a little bit more about the San Francisco what's Chronicle, right?
The Examiner, yeah.
And we won't talk about his ancestor in the day the world stood still. Earth stood still.
All right. So about our next month on December the 9th, which is a Tuesday night, of course, that is our next 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series. It's going to be delivered by Peter Goldstein, a retired professor. And he talks about, his topic is, this is interesting, a season on the stink. Not the brink, the stink. And he's going to be talking about the 19th century, of course, 1899 Cleveland Spiders, which is, most people agree, was probably the worst team in baseball history. And he talks about playing the season on Stratomatic. So that should be a very interesting presentation. One of the first books I ever read was by Tom Hetrick, who wrote Misfits about that team. And so Peter Goldstein will be presenting that a month from now. Just about 5 or 6 days short of that, on December the 4th, which is a Thursday night, we will be having our next 19th century book club discussion, given by Paul, Langendorfer.
Yeah.
And his book is Tom Gilbert's book on how baseball happened. So great subject and a great presenter. So we look forward to that, both December the 4th and December the 9th. And that's what we got coming up for next month. And just watch for our reminders. Thank you again, Steve, and Bob. Thank you for really orchestrating this thing and pulling it all together. Good evening to everyone.
Got several comments in the chat about how much fun this was. It was just a very entertaining presentation. Thank you again, Steve. And thank you all for coming. Well, look forward to seeing you next month. Have a good night. Have a good month. Night all.
Good to see you all.